Development event series. And this is organized by myself and by my colleague Chiara. And we organize this usually for the Department of Psychology, for our PhD students, postdocs, research assistants, anyone who wants to come and learn something new. And we usually have about 5 or 6 events in the academic year. And we advertise them all in advance. You can find information on the psychology web pages, in the calendar, and on the postgraduate pages. So I think today we also have some participants from other departments, because academics from psychology may have distributed this information about this event to their collaborators who might be postdocs from, I believe, the Warwick Medical School, and maybe other departments. So a very warm welcome to everyone. And if you would like to attend future events, then you're very welcome to, especially if they're in the online format like this one. So what we're going to do today is we're going to have a presentation by Dr. Priya Silverstein. And I believe that this presentation is around 1 hour. Is that right? Yeah,
yeah.
approximately. And we'll have plenty of time for questions and discussion. Probably most of the discussion will happen after the talk, but Priya has let me know that they are happy to be interrupted. If you have a question, you can raise your hand or pop it in the chat. Just a heads up, this session is being recorded and transcribed. We do this because we want to document this session as a valuable resource for those who are attending today, but also those who could maybe not make it to this session, to look back at the recording and listen again to what was discussed. So that's just a fair warning. So if you don't want to have your camera on or your microphone on, that's fine. You can maybe write in the chat. If you have a bit more of a personal question, you can also email me, and I'll put my email address in the chat, and then I will read out the question anonymously if anything more personal comes up. And in addition, you can also email Priya, and her contact details are on her website, and we can also share those. Okay, so if that's all clear, I would like to introduce our speaker. Priya and I actually have known each other for quite a few years now, as we used to work at the same time in the same lab, and we used to go to conferences together to present our research. And I have very fond memories of this time. I hope Priya does as well. And yeah, it's really nice to see how their career has developed since, and a real pleasure to hear them speak today about such an important topic as open science practices. Just a bit of background about Priya. Priya holds a BSc degree in psychology and an MSc in cognitive neuroscience from Aston University, and a PhD in psychology from Lancaster University, where they conducted experimental research on infant communication and natural pedagogy. I hope I'm saying this correctly. That was my interpretation of the title of the thesis. And Priya has authored papers on how to get started into open science as a postgraduate student, and has written a guide on open science practices across research disciplines. They train researchers at all career stages in open and reproducible science, and all materials from Priya's previous workshops are openly available. So please do check out their website, priyasilverstein.com. There should have been like a really nice colored text or banner. Priya is currently a postdoctoral researcher for the Psychological Science Accelerator at Ashland University. And I understand that this is a globally distributed network of researchers that pool intellectual resources to accelerate the accumulation of rigorous knowledge in psychological science. So that's yeah, a really important job. And I believe that you're working specifically on how to get information from big data projects, right?
Yeah, we're working on big team science research.
Big team science. Okay.
Yeah.
Brilliant. So, in my opinion, there's really no better person to ease you into open science practices. And without further ado, I'll hand over to our speaker, Dr. Priya Silverstein.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. Let me just do my awkward screen sharing transition. So you can let me know if you can see my slides. Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's so nice to be back at Warwick, even if virtually. I do have very fond memories of being there with Suzanne, and yeah, it was my first introduction into research, so very important in getting me to this point. I just for logistics, I can only see my slides, so if you want to say something, then just unmute or put a note in the chat, and then Suzanne will say something. But yeah, feel free to interrupt at any time. This can be very informal, and if you have any questions, they can either be when I'm talking about something specific, or at the end is fine too. And then I can also later run through just a bit of screen sharing on how to use the OSF for some of these different practices that I'm going to introduce. But yeah, we can just see whether if everyone already knows how to use the Open Science Framework, then we don't need to do that. So we can be receptive to people's experience and skills in where we go from here. So Suzanne did a great job introducing me. So I just to kind of go over a bit of that again. So I'm a psychologist, well, trained as a psychologist up until my PhD, but I'm now working as a meta scientist. And so that I'll talk a little bit about how that transition happened. But most importantly for this talk, I'm a very anxious person, and I kind of I'm often worried about how to do my science best, and worried about whether I'm doing something wrong. And I realized along the way that lots of other people are like that too. So this is hopefully going to be able to alleviate some of those anxieties for if you're feeling the same way. So I'll do a bit of background on how I became involved in open science in the first place. And so I was doing my PhD in developmental psychology, and I came in bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, very excited, excited to be reading about all the cool research that was being done in developmental psychology. But then I was also learning a little bit about the replication crisis and hearing that, maybe we can't rely on a lot of the research that's been published already. And so I felt a bit conflicted and confused about how to decide what to do in my PhD, because I thought, well, we've been taught that you read the literature and you get ideas from that and you build on them to come up with your own studies. But if I don't know which studies in the literature I can rely on and which I can't, then how can I do that? How can I build on it? And so I was having a bit of an existential crisis. So it reminded me of this PhD comics strip. So, hey, Cecilia, what are you doing? Oh, I'm just sitting here pondering my life and my place in the universe. What does it all mean? What motivates me? Have I made the right decisions? I thought you were doing research. These are open questions too. So I was having similar questions and wondering about what direction to take my PhD in. And so I ended up deciding that because I didn't know which findings in the literature I could rely on, I would have to start my PhD with a replication study. And then I had all these cool ideas for how I wanted to build on that afterwards. But then I did the first replication study and was not able to replicate one of the studies in the literature. So then I couldn't build on it because I couldn't even replicate the original result. I then ended up doing another study that was like loosely based on a study from the previous literature, and then got a finding that was kind of surprising. So then I thought, oh, let me just quickly replicate the original study just so that I can kind of clarify why I got this weird finding, and then wasn't able to replicate that one either. So yeah, I was feeling pretty bad about the field, but I think open science kind of gave me something to feel confident in, that maybe if like the issues with the previous literature were because of people not being open enough, and at least if I could continue my own research being as open as possible, then I could not contribute further to the problem in the big problems in psychology and science more generally. So my slides are being a bit weird from my end. I'm not sure which slide you can see right now. Let's see. Oh, let's go back. Okay.
The paper, we can see the paper.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And so then I was acquiring a lot of knowledge in open science because I was excited about it, and speaking about it at conferences and things like that. And so then I was invited by Umul Kathawala and Moin Saeed to co-author a paper on easing into open science for PhD students and their advisors. And this was completely out of the blue. I hadn't previously collaborated with either of them, and it ended up being one of the best things that happened. So we decided that after talking to people, what was needed was a paper on how to just get started in open science at all. The reason we thought this was important is because open science can feel a bit like an insurmountable challenge, like climbing a mountain. Can feel like that you have to acquire loads of skills in order to get to the top, and it might be unclear what path you need to take, and there might be conflicting information about which path is best. And so we decided that in our paper, we wanted to provide a roadmap for how to ease into open science, to make it a little bit easier for people. And this is by no means to say that this is the only way you can ease into open science, but we just wanted to provide people with one option for how to best get started in open science practices. And so in our paper, we outline the what, why, how, and worries associated with 8 different open science practices. And so I'll be going through those today. But first, I think it's important to kind of know what our definitions are. And so there's lots of definitions for open science out there, and they focus on kind of different aspects of openness. So some are to do with like accessibility, like who has access to scientific output, and who is being like involved in science as participants, as authors, as other stakeholders. But yeah, then there's other kind of angles to open science to do with transparency, so documenting all parts of the research process, or like replicability and reproducibility, being able to get the same results when you redo a study in different types of ways. And so I like this definition, the open scholarship umbrella. It covers most of the things that I think are important about open science. Sometimes it's called open scholarship because this involves subjects that aren't traditionally thought of as sciences, or also because it involves all aspects of the research process, including teaching and not just research. And so you can see that at the bottom of this, we also have equity, diversity, and inclusion, not as one part of open scholarship, but kind of underpinning all of it. So I just wanted to kind of hammer that home, that even if we did all the practices that I talk about in this paper, but didn't focus also on making science more open and equitable to everyone who wants to participate, then it wouldn't really be truly open science. So even though I'm not going to talk about ways that we can make science more open in that way in this talk, it's just important to know that this is definitely a part of open science. And if you want to read more about that, then I would recommend Olivia Guest and Kirsty Whistaker's article that I link here. On most of the slides at the bottom, by the way, you can see a link to a bit.ly link to these slides. So there's lots of links in the slides. If you want to grab that link, then you can follow along or look later at some of the resources that I'll be sharing. Yeah, like right here. So the first big question is, why would we do open science at all? And there's all the kind of good moralistic reasons. So obviously the science that has been closed so far has not taken us in the right direction towards truth. We know that a large percentage of findings in the literature can't be replicated in psychology and in lots of other fields as well. It's a waste of funding, often coming from taxpayers of different countries. If the research that we're doing, we don't even know if we can rely on the findings from that research. It's also, just a waste of money in that if we are not sharing all our materials for other people to build on, then money is being wasted by reinventing the wheel several times. It's if we want to solve many of the world's problems in the social sciences and the life sciences, then we really want to be making sure that we can rely on the research that we're doing. And currently that's just not the case. So these are all reasons for doing open science. But there's also more selfish reasons for doing open science as well. And these selfish reasons are not bad, even though I've symbolized them with the little devil icon, because it's completely reasonable to worry about things like your future career success, whether you're going to be able to get a job. Like, there's not many of us who don't need to worry about those things and can just say, oh, whatever happens, if I'm unemployed for months, then it doesn't really matter. Most of us are relying on the money from the jobs that we do to survive. So so I think the selfish reasons are also really important. And so luckily, open science is becoming more of something that is looked upon positively, both within academic and non-academic hiring. It can also it's looked, and it's also being more and more incentivized in things like by funders and also by journals. So I think now it's no longer like this niche thing that it used to be, where it's likely to make you less likely to publish. I think we've kind of moved over into a realm where now it makes it easier to publish research and is almost expected. So yeah, I think the selfish reasons are definitely there too. And so how do we do open science? And if you just Google something like open science, you'll get a lot of results. And so it can be kind of difficult to wade through them all, and especially when they're like when different ones are conflicting. There's a lot. I mean, there's no kind of one consensus on how best to do anything within open science. There's a lot of debate because you've got people involved who are very invested in kind of what they think is the right way to do science, and we don't have enough evidence yet to know what the best way is, and often it's very nuanced depending on the type of research you do and other aspects, what the best way forward is in that situation. So yeah, it can be hard to just get started if you're just starting from scratch and Googling how to do something, and it can just be really overwhelming. And so for that reason, when in our paper and in this talk, I'm going to be talking about how we can do many open science practices using the open science framework. And so the open science framework is it's run by the Centre for Open Science, and it's a kind of online platform which helps you enact many of the practices that I'll be talking about. So you can share materials and data there, you can pre-register analyses, you can upload preprints. So I think I'm going to be using open science, the open science framework as an example for how to do open science, not because it's the best for any of those individual things. Like there's many data sharing platforms out there that do their job a lot better because they've been doing it for years, and that is literally the only thing they were ever made to do. And so they have much more like complex options for different types of data and things like that. But I think as an easing into open science, the OSF is really great for being a kind of one-stop shop for many of the different practices. So I feel like if you can wrap your head around all the different ways you can use OSF, then you're kind of already part of the way there. What worries do people have about doing open science generally? One of the big worries that I came up against myself and also many of my peers when I was doing my PhD was, how do I sell this to my supervisor or my advisor? And I think that's hopefully becoming a little bit easier now that open science is more mainstream, but there still can be a lot of worries from more senior academics who have been doing things a different way for many years and are worried about changing everything up and kind of have their own ideas about how to succeed in academia. And so a lot of the worries that I'll be going through in the talk and in the paper are things that supervisors have directly said to me or my peers, and hopefully we can equip you with some of the replies that will convince them that these open science practices are a good idea. Another thing people worry about is that it will be harder to publish research if you are doing things more openly. And I would just say that we don't have the data on this. But anecdotally, it really just doesn't seem like that's the case. I think people do look positively upon open research, and I think that more and more it's being seen positively, and especially if you you can select journals that are still very high impact factor that prioritize open science and then get rewarded for publishing open research there. But one of the main worries is just, what if I get it wrong? And I think this is a worry that is a worry just with science in general, not just with open science. And it's a big worry. No one wants to feel like they don't know what they're doing. No one wants to be embarrassed to do something wrong. But I mean, I think in science generally and in open science, it's absolutely fine to get things wrong. And I think if anything, when you're doing open science, it's almost expected that you'll get some things wrong and that you'll just be transparent about that. And I think it's good for us to just normalize that. But yeah, hopefully with some tips, you're less likely to get big things wrong. So hopefully this will help. So I'm just going to start going through the 8 that we outline in the paper, and then later I'll talk about a few bonus ones as well. And so I heard when we were just having the informal chat at the beginning, I know that it sounds like there's a PhD journal club, which is already great. And I'm sure that you've experienced the benefits of having a journal club generally, regardless of topic. So that's where we start. So if you're not, not engaging in any open science, the first thing you need to do is learn about it. And one of the ways to do that is by participating in the journal club. And we've classed this as easy because it's literally as easy as just turning up and reading a paper. So specifically, we're talking about a journal club to discuss open science and reproducibility. And so in a journal club, usually someone presents a paper and leads a discussion. And these can really range from very informal to more formal. So from the most informal, this will look like, no one really presenting, but everyone just brings a copy of the paper and you just have a very unstructured discussion. And this can range to someone, having slides and presenting the paper more formally, and then maybe leading people through a series of questions. So why would we want to do this? I think it's really important for creating a community interested in open science, either at your institution or across institutions. And it's a great way to critically engage with colleagues. So, reading, as we know generally, reading a paper, sometimes if you just take it at face value, you can accept what it says. But if you are discussing it with colleagues, you're more likely to critically engage with it, decide which bits you agree with, which bits you don't, and think about where you stand on a series of debates. So I think this is especially important in open science, where there's so much debate about the right way to do it. And it's also a great way to just make yourself accountable for reading. So I know if you're anything like me, you have an unlimited reading list of papers that you have downloaded and wish that you had a chance to read, but maybe you don't get around to. And this will be the case within your individual topic that you're researching. And then if this is like a whole nother thing, then yeah, it can just feel like it's too much. So having a journal club just makes you accountable to read that specific paper, and you might otherwise never get around to it. And so how to do this, I mean, it can just be really simple as sending an email around to your department saying, I want to start a journal club on open science. Is anyone in? And you can also think about expanding this to other departments. I think that having an interdisciplinary group to discuss these kinds of things can be really cool, because you get to hear about how research is done in other fields. And yeah, it's just really rewarding. But I think the easiest way of all is to join the reproducibility initiative. Let me just get the image up. So reproducibility is a journal club initiative where basically it already has a lot of structure there for how you can run an open science journal club. So they have lists of papers that they recommend people to read in the journal clubs. You can also just join one that already exists. If you look at their calendar, then people have links to the hybrid and virtual versions of their journal clubs. So that if you wanna just attend someone else's rather than start your own, then that's something you can do there too. And yeah, I think it's just a really great initiative. It's nice to have some structure sometimes, so that you don't have to start from scratch. But one worry that people might have about participating in a journal club is that it just takes away from research time and that it's a waste of time. But I would argue that reading is fundamental. So yeah, you would never improve your research methods or learn about new things in your field or in other fields if you didn't read, and so you're going to have to do that anyway. So you might as well get the most from it by actually discussing with colleagues when you've done that. It doesn't actually take any longer than just reading the paper and then however long the journal club is. So yeah, I don't really buy that it's a waste of time. And it could end up saving you time because you can apply what you learn to your research, save you time or improve the quality of your research. So I think it's definitely worth it. So the second practice doesn't really feel open sciencey because it's not necessarily about making anything open, but it's like hinting at the idea that you could make your stuff open eventually. So it's just about how to organize your project workflow. And we've also classed this as easy because it's something that you are likely already doing, but maybe you could improve the way that you do it. And so this is just how you organize your project. So things like folder structure, your naming conventions, how you keep track of versions, whether or not you use cloud storage, and also who has access to what and when. I could go off on such a tangent about this. There's a project that I'm working on at the moment where it was clearly not set up from the outset for everyone to be able to have everyone in the collaborating team to have access to things like the data and the code. And now we're trying to kind of like work out where everything is now that we've got to revise and resubmit, and different people are trying to pitch in and do their bit to help get the revision together. But it's just such a pain because we don't know where anything is. We don't know who has which bits. It's like nice that it was collaborative and different people did different parts of the project, but because there's just no good structure there, it's just an absolute pain. So yes, learn the hard way. Definitely don't do it like that. And so why should we have a more kind of consistent project workflow or a good structure to our projects? As I said, it keeps you organized. Now I'm in a situation where I'm very disorganized with this project, and I'm wasting a lot of time trying to work out what's happened. Instead, you can be organized from the outset. It enhances reproducibility. So, it can be a really horrible feeling if you have you've written up your paper, you have all your results in there, and then maybe you just like want to check something, and then you can't end up getting the same results that you wrote into the paper. And then you don't know why. So yeah, being really organized makes it more likely that you're able to reproduce your results whenever you need to, and that other people can reproduce your results. And also it minimizes mistakes. So if you are clearly labeling all your variables, you have a good you know where everything is, then you're less likely to make mistakes. And also, if you're sharing this with your collaborators, they have the opportunity to check stuff, and then it's not only you with sole responsibility for checking whether there's mistakes. So it can also facilitate collaboration. Yeah, and I think that's also really important in a PhD. So like if you can often feel like you're the one who's responsible for everything on your own, but if you make it easy for your supervisors to be able to collaborate on like looking at your analysis code or checking out something in the data, they're more likely to do it than if you have to kind of send them separate files and a massive explanation of what's in them. So how do we think is best to set up your project workflow? I think the OSF, like I said, I was going to talk about earlier, is a great way to do this. So again, it's not the only way to organize your project workflow, but it's just if you're doing everything in one place, it might make things a bit easier. The great thing about the OSF is you might think of it, if you've already heard of it, you might think of it as somewhere that you share data, but it can also be completely closed and you can just choose to make it public later. So I think it's great because you can just organize stuff there and give access only to your collaborators. They can be able to see where everything is. And then if you choose to do so later, it's as easy as a click to make everything public, as opposed to organizing stuff somewhere else and then having to then later upload it and organize it into the OSF once you want to share. And the OSF also has ways to link with other cloud storage like OneDrive and Google Drive. And this can be really great because you can directly, in OneDrive and Google Drive, the edits you make are automatically saved. Whereas the way the cloud storage, the way the version control works in OSF is that you have to re-upload a document. And if it has the same name, then it's saved as a new version of that document, which can be good if you just want kind of like specific versions, but it's not as good for making edits as you go. So what are the worries that people might have with doing this? So one is that it's scary to make everything public, but you absolutely don't need to do this until you feel comfortable doing so. So like I said, it's more about just making sure that things are organized in a way so that you could easily make it public if you wanted to, but not wanting to make it public is not a reason to not have good organization, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So this is an example of what a project might look like on the OSF. So this is from my first postdoc that I did in developmental psychology. So you have your contributors, and so you can see this says private make public. So at the moment, this would, when I got the screenshot, this would have been private. And so all these people would have access. In the wiki, you can just describe some more details about the project and maybe what the files are, and then you have your files here that you just upload, and this is where you could also link with things like Google Drive, and then tags are useful for once if you do choose to make it public, then for people to be able to find it. So yeah, it's pretty simple.
Can I ask you a question about this?
Yeah. Sure.
I was just wondering if you knew whether OSF has a version history of things you upload. So I know that OneDrive, for example, if you upload the same file twice, you can actually have access to the history of what that file looked like. So you have an analysis done and then you upload it again. Does OSF remember what the initial version of your
Yes, yeah. So OSF keeps all the versions. So yeah, it's exactly the same where if you upload a document and it has the exact same name, then it just uploads it as another version, and then you can just go through the versions.
Yeah, so a user could be accessing. Someone looks at this, they would be able to see what version one looked like.
Yes, yeah, they would. And that's actually a really good point because later, so one of the important things is if you are going to share and it needs to be anonymous for like anonymous peer review, then that's something to think about, because if you maybe had versions that weren't anonymous in there and then you upload a new version that is anonymous, then theoretically someone would be able to go and see the original version that was not anonymous. So if you want to get around that, then you just need to delete the file and then upload the new version. But yeah, by default, you will see the previous versions, which is usually a good thing. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so the third practice is preprints, and we've also classed this as easy because it's, I mean, I think this might even be like the easiest one, because it's literally just uploading a file, one file to the internet. So a preprint is an author formatted version of a manuscript. So not the fancy PDF that the journal creates, but just like your own version the version that you would submit, for example. It serves as an openly accessible version of a manuscript, but it can be also instead of publication, before or after publication. So there's different benefits to kind of when you would upload a preprint. So these different benefits depend on when you do it. So you can make stuff available that you might not want to publish at all. So for example, if you're finishing off your PhD, you haven't been able to submit this paper to a journal, and maybe you're now going into a non-academic job and you don't want to be working on this in your evenings and weekends for no reason, then you might want to just put a preprint up of that work so that it's out there, even if you don't want to do anything more with it, and then other people can benefit from that. Because I mean, I can't even imagine how much work just disappears into the ether because people don't publish it during their PhD and then just decide very reasonably to go into a different type of work. But if you can also use it to get more feedback and exposure for your paper, potentially before it's published. So you can upload a preprint before you submit to a journal or at the same time as submitting to a journal, and then see what people think. I haven't had like extensive reviews through doing this, but I have definitely had people pick up on little things or be like, oh, I think that's like not exactly what we meant in that paper that you've cited, where you've cited us, or because they'll get like a notification that they've been cited, whereas if they only get that notification once the paper is published, then that's too late to make edits. So I think it's a really good kind of way to just get things, get a little check on things at that point. And also, even if you've already published a paper and you never had a preprint, you can use preprints to make your paper openly accessible regardless of which journal you published in. So let's say you couldn't afford the APC for an open access publication, you can still make that publication open access by uploading a preprint, which in this case is sometimes called a postprint of that same paper that you've published. So it's as simple as just uploading something to a preprint server. So in psychology, the most common one is PsyArchive, but there's also OSF preprints, which is open to any topic. The great thing is you can also link with an OSF project. So that way all your materials and anything that you've shared to do with that project can be linked together with the preprint version of the paper. You can apply a license. So for example, CC BY license means that people can use the content in it, but they have to attribute you. And yeah, I would really recommend Moin's blog on preprints. It just has some really good tips for the types of things to include on a title page, for example, just thinking about what information you might want someone to have when they download that paper. So a massive worry that people have is that they won't be able to submit to a journal if their paper is already out there as a preprint. And in most cases, this just literally isn't true. So you can check Sherpa, a website called Sherpa Romeo, and look up the journal that you're interested in submitting to, and it will tell you what their preprint policy is. But in almost all cases, an author formatted version is absolutely allowed to be uploaded as a preprint. This is a worry that I definitely had before I'd submitted a preprint. So I worried that because I'd get citations on the preprint, optimistic, then I worried that my citations would be spread between this preprint and the eventual article, and then that would make it basically look like I had less citations than I had. But you can actually merge these in Google Scholar. There's just an easy way to say basically these are the same paper, and then those citations will just be combined. And so this is an example of what it looks like. So for a meta situation, this is the preprint of the paper that I'm discussing right now. So yeah, it just looks very plain, but then people are able to download that if they can't access the paper itself. So, and I think we uploaded this before the paper was published and got a lot of good feedback and suggestions to make it even better. So that was really helpful for this project. Okay, so the next one is reproducible code, which we've classed as medium, just because there's a bit more complexities to how best to do this depending on the type of analysis that you've done and which software you've used. So this is sharing code for your analyses and data visualizations. And this allows both you and others to rerun this code and generate the same output that you did that you've put in your manuscript. And so having code for your analyses and data visualizations is great because it means that you can easily modify this rather than if you need to make a small change, rather than going through all the clicks that you did last time and trying to remember exactly how you did something. It's also easier to detect errors because you've got like the code actually written down what you did. So whereas if you're just pointing and clicking as you do your analyses, then you might just click something wrong by mistake and not realize. It's a lot easier to share with others. I mean, I do advocate for, if you absolutely can't work out how to share code from your analyses, then you could, like, I guess, take a screen recording of you clicking through all the analyses, but it's maybe not as helpful or easy to share with others. And so I like to say that this varies in codiness, which is a word that I have coined, codiness TM. So if you're using point and click software like SPSS or JASP, then you can just save your syntax. You don't need to code in order to have reproducible code. But if you're using a software where you code like R or I don't know, Python or something, then you can just save your code afterwards. Well, save your code as you're going, I mean, but as in save the code that you're writing. And in both cases, it's really important to annotate. So even if you think that it's really obvious why you've done something, it might not be obvious to either future you or someone else. So yeah, just annotate as much as possible. There's never, I would argue there's never too much annotation in code. So what might you worry about? You might think that it's too time consuming to do this, either to learn how to code or to get everything ready to share. But it really can save you time in rerunning analyses. So it's likely that you're going to have to do similar things at another point in another study. And it's so much easier to be able to come back to your code and think, now I can just adapt this for what I need for this new project. People do worry that there's a steep learning curve for some software, for example, R. And it's true, it can be really hard, especially when you don't have like dedicated time. So I remember during my PhD, we had like a 5-day R course that was just every day, 9 to 5. And that was like amazing. And that was how I learned how to code. But if you don't have the time to sit down and do that, then it can be harder to just learn gradually on your own. But there's loads of great resources out there that we link to in our paper. So yeah, I would definitely recommend, if you're not already using R, then to take a look. But also I think JASP is a great alternative where it's open source, point and click, but then you can also see the R code that's been generated by it. So you can share that and also use that to add to it if there's anything that you can't do in JASP that you want to do separately. But yeah, even if you do use point and click software, just remember that you can save and share the script from that, and I would definitely recommend doing that. So you can just upload your code as a file within the OSF like any other file, and yeah, then so R code, for example, gets previewed in OSF, so you don't need to download it to see it, and yeah, then anyone can just have access to that, which is scary but also great. And so even if you're sharing your code, people often think of sharing code and data as like the same, but I think there's cases where you might share only one and not both. So we have them as separate. So sharing data, we've also classed as medium because of the different concerns that go into it depending on the type of data that you're sharing. So this is just making your anonymized data openly available for people. And this can either be through a repository, so through something like sharing on the OSF, for example, or you can have a formal system in place for how people can request the data. And this has to be formal rather than just data available on request, because it's been shown quite a few times now that when people say data available on request, this is just not true. And when it's requested, it's actually often just ignored. And if you do choose to share with your code as well, then you have the added benefit of that analyses can be reproduced as well, the analyses from your paper. So why would you do this? So one is for quality and accuracy checks. so that people can, make sure that everything looks right in the data, and that it makes sense how you describe how you did your analyses in the paper. Also, so that others can expand on analyses. So there might be variables that you didn't even think of looking at together, or something in the data set that you just weren't interested in for your particular paper, but that someone else is really interested in. So then they can do other analyses on your data. And it also means that they can be easily included in meta-analyses. So I've had a situation, I tried and failed to do a meta-analysis because I got as far as like trying to look for all the papers and extract the data that I needed from them. And even that part was just so hard because of people just not reporting in the paper what I needed, and then also not sharing the data, that I just gave up in the end. So that was quite sad. So it makes it a lot easier for people to include your data in meta-analyses, and therefore cite you if your data is available. And I think also it signals a commitment to transparency. So I think people often feel like no one's going to care about my data anyway. And I think that in many cases, people will care more than you think they will. But even if no one ever looks at it, I do think it just signals openness in a way that you are saying, here is what I used. You'll probably never look at it, but if you choose to, it's here. And I think that just is quite a brave thing to do. And also, it just signals your commitment to transparency, which I think is a nice thing to do. So ideally, you would make plans for data sharing before you begin your study. And so this is, even if you're not sure that you want to share, it's always better. If you might want to share, it's better to make sure that you've got things in place in your consent form and things that make it easier for you to share the data if you chose to later. But you can also check what's possible afterwards too. So I've been in projects where the ethics had already been done, or the consent form was already finalized, data collection had begun, and then I was interested in sharing data. I would recommend just asking the data management team at your university what they think of your specific case, because in most cases, if the data is truly anonymous, then it is actually fine to share it, even if you didn't get explicit consent to do so. So a big worry that people have is that other researchers will use their data to answer new questions, and and will basically gain something from the hard work that you've done yourself. And I would say, as my first answer to this, yes, that's kind of the whole point. Like one of the reasons that we're making things more open is so that people can build on things that we've started, and we can build up science together. But I do also understand, like I was talking about the selfish things at the beginning, I do also understand that, you might want to make sure that you have done what you want to do with the data before you make it open. So that's also an option. You can, if you have like a massive project and you have specific papers that you want to get out of it, you can just say that we're going to share our data at this point in the future, which might be later than when the paper is published, just so that you can kind of get what you need to get out of it. But yeah, I would argue that in most cases, it's just a good thing that other people are doing stuff with your data, and you'll still get cited when they do that. So that's always a good thing. People also worry about not getting credit if someone does choose to use your data, but this is where licenses are important. So you can apply a CC BY license, which means that you have to be credited if someone uses your data. And yeah, so I think in most cases people are good about this. I haven't heard of any like bad situations in any of the workshops that I've done of people using data without crediting the person. I think that's probably a very rare case, so I wouldn't worry too much about that. And so again, these are just files that you upload to the OSF. So in this case, the data was downloaded by participant, and so then in my script I just merged these together, or you could have one data set that has everything in it. So you just upload your data files, for example, to the OSF, and then other people can access them. Okay, so transparent manuscript writing. This is one that seems a bit maybe out of place compared to the others, because it's not really it's not like you're not using a tool, you're not doing something specific, but it literally just means following guidelines and standards in your respective field. making sure that you're not hiding anything. So for example, analyses that you've done and then decided weren't right, maybe because they you didn't like the results that you got. So not hiding things like that. Justifying all your decisions, for example, your exclusion criteria, your stopping rule. And so why would we want to be transparent? So I think the main thing is that it's just really helpful for understanding your work and its implications. But I think also it can really speed up peer review. So often when I haven't been completely transparent about something, then reviewers end up asking anyway. So then like, you know, if I haven't explained why I made all these decisions, then reviewers are likely to just ask, can you explain why you made this decision? So if you just have all that information out there from the outset, then that can be a bit easier. And I also think it makes replication a lot easier. So things that you think might not be important about the way that you did things might actually end up being really important if someone wants to replicate your research. So I think it's just better to be as transparent as possible. And so there's lots of kind of general guidelines out there for what you should include when you're reporting. So I'd recommend checking out any of these papers. But yeah, in general, the idea would just be to be as transparent as possible about everything that happened in the research process. And so people worry that this will take too long, but I don't think it should actually take any longer than doing your research the way that without this. So I think you should ideally be logging your decisions as you go, so that it shouldn't be that you should have to look in, like go back through loads of emails to work out why you made some decision. Like it would be much better if you just log your decisions as you go in a way that makes it easy to then write them up in the eventual paper. People also worry that it will take up too many words in the manuscript. So some manuscripts, some journals have word limit requirements, but it's absolutely fine to upload like lots of extra detail as a supplementary document, especially if you upload these to the OSF as opposed to with your journal, just along with all the rest of your materials that you choose to share. Then you can have unlimited space, unlimited numbers of documents, and you can basically just, have all that information there without it taking up space in the manuscript. And I think the biggest worry that people have about being honest is that it's embarrassing, especially if you have to admit that you made a mistake. But I would argue that it's the opposite of embarrassing. I think that we're showing that we're trustworthy, and I think it's more embarrassing to hide stuff. And yeah, I think we should be trying to work towards a research culture where it's completely normalized to just share our mistakes that we make. So this could look like saying something like 7 further infants were tested but not included due to experimental error. Or it could look like saying something like, we also performed this analysis and results from this can be found in our supplementary materials. So, you know, it can be quite succinct, but yeah, just being as open as possible. Okay. Next, we have pre-registration, which we've also classed as medium, because again, it can vary in how much detail or how much effort you want to put into it. But pre-registration in general is posting a time-stamped outline of any of the following. So your research questions, your hypotheses, your method, and your analysis plan. And so the most important, so I think pre-registration is the one that's been the most debated in the open science community of the why, because I feel like there are a few different whys and different people put different amounts of emphasis on the different whys. So I think that the most important one is to just clarify when things happened. It's as simple as that, literally just a transparent record of when you had your research questions and hypotheses, so that you can show to reviewers, for example, that you had these hypotheses before you have the data and not afterwards, and also your methods and analyses, so when you made decisions about those, so that reviewers don't think that you came up with this analysis plan just because it was the only one that got you the result that you wanted. And so the OSF has lots of different templates that you can use that you can use to pre-register. And these have various levels of specificity. So you can just pre-register your hypotheses and your methods in varying levels of detail. But you can also think about uploading to your project and registering the materials that you're going to use for your study. You can have a really complex decision tree of which analysis you're going to do based on different aspects of what the data look like once you get them. You can have your code ready and even tested on simulated data and pre-register this. And so I think, yeah, pre-registration can look very different depending on how you do it and how much effort you want to put in and have time to put in. So I think people worry that pre-registration will stifle creativity or limit exploration, but this is just literally not true. You can still explore as much as you want. It will just be clear the differentiation between what is exploration and what is not exploration. People also worry that you won't be able to deviate if you make any mistakes, but you absolutely can deviate. You just need to be honest about why. I think in my first pre-registration, I just made like the silliest mistake, like saying that it was going to be a repeated measures study when it wasn't, or vice versa. And then I literally just had to put a little note saying I was silly. It was always planned to be this way, but I just wrote it wrong in the pre-registration. Sorry. So that or less silly but other mistakes, you can just be honest about them. And yeah, it's just a way of explaining where you are at different stages of the research process. And so this is what a pre-registration looks like. So you just have the different questions and then you have your answers to them. And then it tells you the date that you registered this so that you know, yeah, when you had all these decisions made about your study. Okay, and so this is the last one that's in the kind of in the paper that I've been like drawing this from, but then I have a few extra bonus slides after this as well. So yeah, as always, gone on longer than expected, but luckily we're here until 11:45, so that we've got lots of time still for discussion after that as well. And so registered reports are similar to pre-registration, but a bit different. So these are papers that are reviewed before data collection. And so if they're accepted at a specific journal, then the full version will later be published, regardless of the result. And so the acceptance in the journal is based on the quality of the design, not on the results. And so this reduces publication bias because journals commit to publishing regardless of whether or not you get a null result in the key findings. It means as an individual, selfishly, that you get a guaranteed publication in whichever journal you've submitted to, regardless of your results. Sorry. And it can lead to a stronger design due to the review process. It's basically like getting a free consultation on your paper from experts in the area. So it's really great just for that, even if you didn't have the other parts about it being guaranteed publication. And so how it works is you develop your idea, you design your study, and you write it up, the introduction and methods. And this undergoes stage 1 peer review. And then if you're granted in principle acceptance, that means that the paper will be published if you do everything as you said you would do it. And so then you go away and you collect and analyze your data, you write up the rest of the paper, and then it undergoes stage 2 peer review, where they make sure that you followed the plan that you said you were going to follow, and they review the rest that they didn't review before. And then your report is published. So it's really important to work out timeline and feasibility. So that's why I think I didn't mention, but this is classed as hard. So especially if you're on like a fixed term contract, either during your PhD or a job that's only for a few years or something, then you need to work out whether a registered report makes sense within that timeline, because obviously you need to collect your data before you finish. And so what I would recommend is finding a journal in your field that offers registered reports. There's a list on the Centre for Open Science website, which I think I linked to in a couple of bullet points. Yeah, this cos.io/rr has a lot of a list of participating journals and also checklists to use to avoid desk rejection. So what I would do is I would combine those resources with the specific journal requirements for the journal that you want to submit to, and try and work out whether it's going to be feasible within your timeline. And you can also just directly email the editor of the journal or the registered reports editor of the journal to ask what an estimated timeline is. And also I'll add to this, more recently there's this initiative called Peer Community in Registered Reports, and they offer a really exciting option for scheduled peer review. So essentially what you do is you say, for registered reports. So you say, I'm going to submit my stage 1 registered report on this date, and then they line up reviewers so that you can get your reviews within, I think it's like 2 weeks or something. After submitting it. So that's really cool, and a great way to speed up the timeline. And then if PCI registered reports offers you in principle acceptance, then what that means is that the eventual registered report you can choose to publish in any of the journals that are associated with PCI registered reports. And it includes lots of really great psychology journals, so I definitely have a look at that. So people worry that it will take too long, and this is a very justified worry in terms of like making sure that you collect data at the right time for your project. But the entire project, including publication, is likely to take less long than in the traditional way. I'm sure that we all have seen or been involved in papers that took absolutely years to get all the way to being published because of cycling through multiple journals, people changing jobs, not having time to work on the revisions, etc. Whereas with registered reports, I feel like people are a lot more motivated to like get things done because they know that they've got that publication at the end once they have the in principle acceptance. So I don't actually think it takes longer than traditional publishing. I think it just is, you just need to think carefully because you have less control over when data collection can start. And so I've gone through the 8 practices that we talk about in our paper. So journal clubs, project workflow, preprints, reproducible code, sharing data, transparent writing, pre-registration, and registered reports. So I'd say that these are the main ones that you can use to ease into open science. But I'll just talk about a couple of bonuses here. So we were talking a little bit about this in the chat before we started with the talk. So big team science, I think, is a great way to ease into open science. So big team science is any method involving a relatively large number of collaborators who may be dispersed across labs, institutions, disciplines, cultures, and or continents. But in psychology, usually what we think of when we think about big team science is people coming together to collect data for one study where they collect data in multiple locations all over the world. And this is great for many reasons. So you're pooling resources, time, money, and ideas. You can investigate heterogeneity because you have big enough samples to be able to look at stuff like, oh, if you have this slightly different method, or if you, oh, let's look at how this varies based on language input or anything that you might be interested in, you have a big enough sample to be able to look at that. You can have adversarial collaboration and therefore strict theory testing because you can bring people together who maybe have different ideas about what the results would be or how best to design the study and then come up with a design that everyone's happy with. I think that big team science can also work really well as open science training because they often are kind of big team science organizations are often front runners in open science practices. And so you can kind of get a chance to test the waters with some of these practices, like being involved in a registered report, for example, without being the person who's like solely responsible for doing that. And I think it's also a way to gain a cool publication that signals your open science values. Even if you've just had a small part in a big project, then it kind of shows that you do value collaboration and value open science. And so the best way to do this is to sign up to an existing collaboration. And so some of the ones that are recommended for psychologists, I know that there's some non-psychologists in the audience, so I know that there's lots of other ones out there as well. So one is the Psychological Science Accelerator, which is the one that I work for in my postdoc. And so this is generally psychology. So if you do research with adults, then this is probably the best one to sign up for. There's also Many Babies, which I know that maybe one or some of you in the audience have participated in. This is for developmental research. And then a really cool one is Many Manys. So I know that there's like some, well, at least when I was still an RA at Warwick, there were some people working there who were involved in like primate research. So Many Manys is a great big team science effort looking at cross-species comparison. So the same study, but across species. And that's really cool because I think that would be a really cool one to get involved in if you haven't So like if you, for example, are a developmental researcher and you haven't had the opportunity to be involved in cross-species research, this is a great way that you don't have to actually learn how to test all these other animals, but you can still be involved in this study that's cross-species. And so people might worry that they don't have enough experience, but there's so many different ways that you can contribute to big team science. So you definitely have enough experience to be involved in one. You just have to find the right one for you. They might also worry that they don't have enough time, but you can choose how much time you put into the collaboration. And usually there's very clear guidelines at the beginning for what the minimum requirements would be for collaboration. And you can decide whether that works for you. Another worry is that big team science papers don't count when in terms of like hiring and promotion. But big team science papers are becoming increasingly highly valued by many potential employers inside and outside academia. And I think, as with anything, I kind of always think if you just go with the things that you value and the things that you find interesting, then you will find yourself to an employer who also values those same things as you. So yeah, I don't think it's a hindrance to your career, especially considering that it doesn't take as much effort as like conducting your own research, because you're one of many people contributing to a big project. Another way that you can ease into open science is to find open science community. So journal clubs are one way of doing that, but there's other open science communities out there that I thought I'd plug. You can, I think these are great because you can learn from others, you can share. So you might have one specific, you might be really experienced in pre-registration, but be a bit scared about sharing data. And then you can kind of, you help someone with pre-registration and they help you with sharing data. You can keep up to date with the ongoing conversation in open science because there's always new innovations and new things to learn. So yeah, it's a good thing for that. And also it's a great way to forge collaborations and solve problems in open science together. And so you can just join a community, usually just online. So there's info on all of these websites. So one I would recommend is the Society for the Improvement of Psychological Science, which I'm co-chair of. So we have an annual conference. We also have grants that you can apply for. You can join committees on different things that you might be interested in. And yeah, and you can apply for a fee waiver if you can't afford to join. Then I run Nowhere Lab. So this is a lab for anyone who doesn't have a lab. So I assume if you're here, in most cases, you'll probably have a lab because you're at a traditional like university, but maybe you don't. Maybe if if you are your supervisor's only student, for example, or yeah, if you just don't have that lab meeting experience and you want one, then you can join our weekly meetings, and we also have a Slack. And then I would also really recommend FORT. I think it's Framework for Open, I don't know, research, responsible research maybe, and training. But yeah, so FORT has a lot of resources out there for learning about open science. So you can just check those out, and you can also join different projects if you want to get involved in open science dissemination. So people might worry that joining a community like this will take up too much time, but none of these have a specific requirement for how much time you have to engage. So you can do as little or as much as you want. You might worry that everyone else there will know more about open science than you do, but there's people from many different levels of experience, and we would be very lucky to have you in any of these groups. And you might also worry about the expense of joining, but all of these are free except SIPS, and SIPS offers fee waivers and reductions. And so I just want to just towards the end kind of say that it's not just early career researchers that need to ease into open science. And I feel like some people can often feel, including me, can feel like the burden is on early career researchers, and then senior academics just kind of float by without engaging much. So, you know, advisors, department heads, hiring committees, funders, and journal editors all need to also ease into open science. And so recently we wrote a very similar guide on easing into open science, but for journal editors, on how they can incentivize open science at their journals. So yeah, everyone is responsible. And so I just wanted to say that, like, I think now is a good time to be easing into open science. This is just from a recent paper that we're writing on kind of what the state of open science uptake is in psychology researchers in the UK and Ireland. And you can see that, you know, in about 2018 was the peak of when people were had first ever engaged in open science. So I think now, like I said at the beginning, it's more normative. It's not as risky. Most people have eased in a little bit to open science already. But saying that, there is massive variation in the different open science practices that I've talked about and many that I haven't talked about. So you can see this is different open science practices and how often researchers in the UK and Ireland engage in them. So 7 is always and 1 is never. And you can see that most researchers have never done a registered report, with more researchers having published open access or declared conflicts of interest in their research. So yeah, there's definitely room for improvement and room to ease into all the different practices that I've talked about and more. And lastly, I'm just going to speculate a little bit about what makes some people engage in open science practices. So in the same paper where we look at researcher uptake of open science in the UK and Ireland in psychology departments, we also looked a little bit at predictors of how much someone engages in open science, and we used the COM-B model of behavior change, capability, opportunity, and motivation. And the one that came out the strongest was automatic motivation. So people who have developed a habit of engaging in open science practices do more open science, which is pretty intuitive and not very theoretically interesting. But what I think it does kind of hammer home is the idea that in order to engage fully with open science, you need to make it a part of your normal research habits. And that's why I think that using the open science framework can be really helpful for that, because if it just becomes part of your normal workflow to use it, then you're more likely to use it in all those different ways that I've talked about using it. And so, yeah, I would recommend making open science a part of your research habits. So I hope that this talk and our paper is helpful in helping you ease into open science. And thanks for listening. Thanks to my collaborators and the reviewers of the original paper, Open Science Twitter, RIP Twitter, but it was, where I originally learned everything I know, and you for listening. So we can have a bit of a chat now, I think. Ooh, let me see, how do I stop sharing?
Yeah.
We can have a chat, and then if you want me to run through some stuff on the OSF with screen share, I can afterwards, but also we can just chat, whatever's better for everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much, Priya. That was great. Just to let you know, there were a few people who posted in the chat, but they weren't questions. They were just sharing information.
Nice.
If that's okay with you, maybe I can just summarize them for those who haven't seen. So Talar from the Warwick Medical School is highlighting a reproducibility journal club, and they are now looking for new participants. So if people want to do something on open science research within that context, they can email the reproducibility email address and find out more from Talar.
That's great.
Samantha is here as well. I think Samantha is working with the library, and she's highlighting the Warwick Research Archive portal, or short RAP, which is our repository that we have at Warwick. And I can say from experience that I have actually documented data sets on their databases, and it's been really helpful also to get support from the library. And there's also another post from Samantha saying that she can offer research data management advice. Always happy to have a chat. So if anyone needs these services, they can click through on the links. And now I think would like to open the floor to questions from anyone here. Please feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourself. Yeah, I think Lucas was first.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. This was really interesting. A lot of food for thought. I think I'll have a very good question tomorrow, but now I need to, just think about the things you've said. So I was in this kind of talks in the summer where some people were talking about open science, and there was a bit of a debate between some people in the field about it. And one of the things that, for me, someone that thinks open science is very important, one of the things that was a bit of a concern is that it does take a lot of time. Or people were saying that it does take a lot of time, and sometimes we're talking about one of the ethical things of open science, and one of the things that people talk about open science is that this is publicly given money, the taxpayers' money that given to us to do research, and so our research should be good. That's an ethical imperative, but our research should also be efficient. That's an also ethical imperative. We shouldn't be dawdling, and of course you can you can caricature, this as, I'm going to have like someone filming me all day and there's going to be all this volume of information of everything that I did at all time. And obviously this is not it, but it is, there is a lot of, I think, extra work in some of these open science practices. And I think, I think the fear was that sometimes this transparency is not necessary at certain stages of research. So if you have models and you kind of building your models, you haven't yet decided what your theory is, and you're just looking at data and seeing what the phenomena are. And that, for example, at that stage, being transparent is not important. Or, that only once you know what your model is going to be like, then you maybe say something about it or not. Like, I don't know if you have a thought of when maybe open science is not that important or that not that necessary, I suppose, and not that efficient.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's two questions in there at least. So one is like, does open science take more time? And the other one is, are there situations where we don't need to be open? So I'll answer both of those. So I think for the first one, with regards to does open science take more time, I just genuinely don't buy it. Like, I know that everyone just says it like it's a fact, but I just don't believe that it takes more time. Like I said, I've seen papers take 10 years to get out with the traditional way. I think that being open means that you have everything in one place, you know where it is, everyone can come back to the project whenever they want and finish off any analyses they need to, etc. I think that pre-registration makes you think about things at a time when you need to be thinking about it, making sure that you do your design well, and not kind of realizing you made a mistake and then having to redo the study. I think the registered reports are even better for this because you're getting input to make sure that you're not making a mistake that later when you go to publish the study, reviewers will say, oh, but why did you do it this way? You need to run another study, another experiment. I think in general, open science saves time. I know that's probably an unpopular opinion, but I think that it does. And I think, so I think that that's one thing. And yes, you have to do more stages, but they're all stages that you should already be doing for your research. You shouldn't just be starting a study without knowing what you're going to be doing or why you would want to do it or what you want to look at. Saying that, I do understand that in maybe more exploratory research, which you might be talking about, then I agree that you don't always know exactly what you're going to do before you start. And I think that there are definitely debates of whether pre-registration is helpful in those kind of situations. But I would say that it's still helpful to outline what you do know, because you always will know something. Otherwise, you're not starting a study. So you'll know what your research questions are. You might not know which direction you're predicting, but you will want to know, I want to figure out the best way to model how language learning happens in autism spectrum disorder or something, I don't know, anything that you might be interested in looking at, you will know something. So you can just pre-register what you do know and not what you don't know. So and with regards to like following people around and videoing them, I mean, I think it would be it would be a cool theoretic, I think it actually would be really cool to see someone's project and everything they do, especially if you're you might take things for granted in a developmental lab, for example, and then someone who's setting one up from scratch might love to see that. So I think that there's nothing that's too silly to make transparent, and it would always be helpful for someone else, but you're always going to have to balance your own needs with wanting to be helpful for other people. But those would be my answers, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really valuable discussion from someone who has engaged in open science practices for a while. I feel that maybe it takes a little bit more time in the beginning of your project, but it will save you a huge amount of time later. And when you show the slide with the selfish reasons for open science, it's really imagine someone emails you 10 years from now asking for the data from your PhD for a meta-analysis, and you're really embarrassed that you can't find it on your like old laptop, or someone asks you for the stimuli from your experiment and you can't share it because you don't know where they are or which versions you actually used in the experiment, because you have like a ton of files on your computer and no coherent file structure. Trust me, it will save you time in the future. And the most important person who's actually going to look at all these things you did in the past is you.
Yeah.
especially when you get a revision from a journal, or when it takes a little bit longer to publish. Yeah.
Yeah. And just to follow up on that, I would say as well, like, I have so many memories of being an RA in Kita's lab, and Suzanne basically was like the perfect example of why open science is great. Even before, I mean, I don't think you even were calling it open science, but just the way that you were doing things. Like, I remember we were at a conference and someone said, oh, why don't you look at like whether these types of stimuli you used have a different effect to these other types of stimuli? And Suzanne just in our Airbnb just wrote like another one line of code and then checked whether it was true. Like, and you know, like that kind of thing is just a perfect example of how it can be faster to do open science than having to like be like, oh yeah, that's so interesting, but I have no time to like redo all those analyses because it was so long ago and blah blah blah. But yeah.
Yeah, that's true. And I remember that is part of the paper, and it really made the paper better, but it was also very clearly stated as, this is something we thought of after we did the experiment. This is a really like an afterthought, but it's kind of cool. And I think that's what it also means to be transparent. And that's why conferences are so useful, to share your ideas and your data. Yeah,
definitely.
Priya, can I ask your opinion on pre-registration following Lucas's comment? So I sometimes think that the PhD especially is a perfect time for exploration and not exactly knowing what you're doing. And then sometimes I think a nice approach is to do a study without pre-registration first, and then really thinking about what does it all mean, and then pre-registering the replication of that study. So what's your opinion on that, and how would you see that in your roadmap?
Yeah, I think that's such a great idea. And I think that if you find something exciting and you're not sure if through exploration and you're not sure whether you can rely on it, it's such a great idea to just do a replication of that like you suggested. And I think that would make such a great paper. I haven't seen papers that have that structure, but I think they do exist. And I think that would be so well received by journals. And yeah, just I would believe in a result so much more if I read about it and it was part of that kind of structure. And I think it balances well that kind of exploration, and also maybe like making some improvements to the design. It's almost like an extensive pilot, like a pilot that you do actually publish. And I think that's a great idea, especially in developmental research. I mean, in all areas, but as an example, in developmental research, we can design a paradigm and then we think we're so clever, and then we get into the room with the child and they just do something that we just absolutely did not expect. So yeah, I think exploring and piloting is really important, and yeah, following it with a replication is great.
Yeah. Are there any other questions from anyone here?
I have more, but I don't want to.
We have plenty of time.
Sometimes I just so you will, I suppose, maybe it's not exactly your case, because I suppose that if you're doing a lot of meta science research from an open science point of view, then you might be surrounded by people that think alike. But you know, you speak to many people, and some of these people might not think alike at all, and might think that, you know, open science is a complete waste of time. And I was just wondering how you approach these conversations, because I think it's very difficult. This is true of open science, or it's true of climate denial, change denial, and it's true of a lot of things. It's difficult to talk to people that are convinced of a position different to your own. So I was just wondering how you approach these when someone's like, "Oh, this is all a waste of time."
Yeah, I think it really depends on what argument they're going for, because like if they are saying, oh no, it will make it harder for you to publish, or or like it's not a good idea for your career, then I would ask them for the data, because they will not have the data. Like, because that doesn't, it doesn't exist. Like, so much of this is like based on myths. If they have the worries that I've kind of outlined in this talk, then I have like my rebuttals that I've shared with you. I think also sometimes you just have to agree to disagree, but just as a student especially, like, be like, this is my project and this is how I want to do it. And if you can't share with me a really good reason for why I
Sure, yeah.
shouldn't.
No, I don't.
But yeah.
I think it'd be easy for me to, if someone comes and say you should have been doing that, I'm like, well, no choice. But that sense is hard. But like, if I'm collaborating with someone, or like I know someone, it's like, oh, I've never registered anything in my life. They say this to me. It's like, well, how do I kind of plant the seed of doubt in this person's head that maybe they should be thinking about whether they should register or not? I think that's quite hard.
Yeah. I think you can also like take baby steps and maybe like meet in the middle a little bit. So for example, through there's a website called As Predicted, which is for pre-registrations, and one of the only differences, so you can use the same questions from As Predicted on the OSF, but one of the only differences between As Predicted and the OSF is that on As Predicted you can choose to never make public the pre-registration. And so I think this can be a really good first step for pre-registration for people who are really scared of it. So you can say to them, how about we write pre-registration and we'll keep it private, and then we will aim to make it public, but if for any reason you decide that it was a bad idea, then we can talk about that together. So I think you can do things maybe in your own research by yourself. You're already at the stage where you're pre-registering your code and everything, but maybe in this project you decide to like hold back a little bit so that you can help ease them into it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I see there's a question from Dua.
Hi, thank you, Priya, for your great presentation and for the map road. Thank you for the information so much. I would like to ask you, you mentioned something about to make sure that your data is licensed so that people will give you credit. Would you please give us more information about that to make sure we are in the safe side, and people not using our data without any credit?
Yes,
Thank you.
Definitely. Yeah. So this is a really good point, because when people kept talking about licenses when I was like learning about open science, and I was like, that seems weird and complicated, but literally it's like one of the simplest things. So I'll just share my screen again to show what it looks like on the OSF specifically. So let me just see a project. So when you have an OSF project, you can apply a license to the entire project. So it basically you just choose from a few different ones. But like I said, the one that I would always recommend is this CC by attribution 4.0. I'll put it in the chat as well later. Oh, not that. And so when you're doing the settings for your project, you can just apply that license to the whole project, and it means that anything that's in that project, people have to attribute you if they use it. But I think, to be honest, in like actually, sorry, let me just stop sharing my screen. I think actually, oh wait, is it still sharing or not? Yeah. In practice, it's very rare, like I said, that someone would use your data without attributing it to you, and it would be embarrassing for them if then you turned around and were like, excuse me, this is where the data came from. So I think in most cases, people will just attribute you anyway, but yeah, that's the way that you would apply it to a whole OSF project. So yeah, it's just as simple as having that setting on the OSF project.
Yeah. And to follow up on that, so a lot of the journals, at least the ones that I submit my work to, they often also specify that they would approve that specific license for your data, or that they would recommend that license, and they would also recommend it for the preprint. And a lot of the journals now have a policy or some guidance on how you can include a data availability statement in your manuscript, which is basically just a paragraph saying which OSF page could people use along with your paper, or which preprint, or the information that Priya is kind of showing on OSF, it needs to be somehow linked to the paper, right? And some journals also ask that you just create a DOI, which is the digital object identifier, with your OSF project. And that's, again, another button press that you can do on OSF. And then you have like unique link to the project as well that people can use to refer to your data or to your materials.
Yeah, good points.
Lucas, you raised your hand again.
Yeah, as I said, I can always wait for other people if they have questions. But so here we've been talking about what we can do as researchers to be more open. But obviously that's kind of the supply side of the whole thing. There's this other like demand side, which is like people that are going to get our research and do something with it, either publish it in a journal or give us a grant because of how good our research is, hire us for a job in academia. And I was just wondering, I think there's a lot of, and I was very glad that you had a slide mentioning this, because I think there's a lot of pressure, or a lot of the conversation on open science is on the researchers' side. What can researchers do to be more open with their science? But in a way, it feels like almost the wrong point of contact. If you want to change a system, you change the incentive structure, and you change the demand side. And if people demand open science, then researchers will quickly move to open science because there's no other way. Like, I was just wondering what you knew. I mean, I know you've mentioned this preprint, you've got all these things that is in press. I was just wondering whether you knew of any kind of movements at the kind of grant givers, the people that are hiring these sort of bodies.
These conversations are happening at all those levels. So I know people who are directly involved in, trying to change policies at funders, trying to change policies at journals, like what I've been doing, trying to change hiring practices at universities. So I think these things need to happen simultaneously. Like, it's like the open science movement was mostly a grassroots bottom-up thing led by mostly early career researchers, and that's absolutely amazing. And without that, we wouldn't be having the top-down change from those other stakeholders. So I think you need both. But I'd also really recommend this blog post by Tal Yarkoni called "It's Not the Incentives, It's You." And so I think it's a really great. So what you're saying is absolutely true, but some people use that as an excuse for not doing anything, because they say, I'm not going to do anything because of the incentives. And this blog post is absolutely amazing for outlining why that argument just isn't very logical. So and I know that's not what you were saying, Lucas. You weren't saying therefore it's a reason to not do it. You were saying,
I've been known to be illogical in the past. I can take it.
No, like that's absolutely not what you were saying. But I just think that the blog is really great for for basically, if anyone says that to you, it has a lot of rebuttals for why that's not a good reason to do nothing.
Okay.
Chiara?
Yeah, thank you so much for all, this amazing discussion. I just wanted to sort of probe you on one potential worry. I think you kind of have mentioned this worry, right? It's the worry about sort of the anxiety of what if people find out I did something wrong. But you could also phrase it differently, which is like, are you if you do endorse open science practices, right? Are you running the risk that people hold you to higher standards than people who don't endorse open science practices, right? So do you think that is the case? Do you think that is something that we should be worrying about, or or not?
It's so hard. I do think it's something. I've seen it happen. Like, even, I mean, one anecdote is I had a friend who was my PhD like buddy, and I encouraged her to be as open as possible, and she shared a video from her paradigm, an example video of how she ran her study, and the reviewers said, oh, but there's this obvious confound that wasn't in your paper, but that in the way that you behaved in these two conditions from the video, was that something that was always the case? And then she had to say, yeah, it was. And so then then the paper didn't get published because of this confound. And like it was so sad, and I felt so guilty because I'd been the one who was like encouraging her to be as open as possible. But then at the same time, I did really think that that confound was important for them to have noticed, and they wouldn't have ever noticed it otherwise. And there's nothing to stop her following that up with a replication that doesn't have that confound, and then showing that it's not that that's driving the effect, or that it is, and then that's the really important thing for people to know. So yes, I think that it is true that if you share something, then people can find mistakes in it or can, criticize it. I hope that that isn't like a barrier to publishing in most cases, unless it is like a real mistake that like means that your conclusions aren't justified. I think in a lot of cases, people will just value that you've been transparent, and as long as if they noticed some limitation, then if you're open about that in your writing, then that should be enough. But yeah, I think that's why it's important to have the top down as well as the bottom up, because if we have journals requiring that everyone shares their data if they're able to, then then people don't get penalized for sharing it in a system where you don't have to. So I think that's why I'm definitely pushing for the top down as well as encouraging the bottom up.
Yeah, thank you. Could I add another point to the discussion about, so I feel like the talk was very clear and maybe convincing a supervisor who is a bit apprehensive and not sure, maybe because they just don't know enough about open science practices and because they've been in the field a long time and they don't know where to start or they don't know enough about it. But I want to kind of flip that upside down and talk a little bit about maybe supervisors who also don't really know what open science is, but they have heard somewhere that we have to all do it, otherwise we can't get published. And I just want to say here on record, that's not true. But maybe we could also talk a little bit about how to deal with, a supervisor's insisting on, for example, one of the practices like pre-registration, but you feel like maybe your project is not at the stage that you can really write a coherent story or expectation for your study, or maybe the nature of your study is not exactly the right study to do this practice per se. Like, how can you tackle that kind of conversation?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Yeah, I think there'll be blog posts out there that argue in whichever direction you need to convince your supervisor of. There's lots of blog posts debating whether pre-registration is useful or not in qualitative research, exploratory research, modeling research. So I think you'll be able to find people who agree with you and then get some points that way, probably. That would be one way. And I also think maybe I think being clear to your supervisor that you do have that you do have the open science values, but in this particular situation, you think it's not good for XYZ reason. And I think also there's opportunities out there for, as well as registered reports, there's a type of report called exploratory reports. I'm not sure how many journals offer them. I know that Cortex definitely offers them, but that's quite a specific subdiscipline of psychology, but where basically you're open about the fact that the project is exploratory, and it's almost like you submit it because you don't want to get penalized in the review process for not having a traditional like hypothesis testing format to your paper. So that's really cool. And there's other journals that like explicitly will accept exploratory work or something like that. So I guess maybe like doing a bit more research about how you could publish the type of work without fitting it into that format, maybe.
Yeah. And another one could be to say we do this study and then the pre-registered version, which is the replication, which makes, within study replication is quite nice.
Yeah.
And in the pre-registration format, there's like different lengths and different amount of detail as well, I suppose, within OSF. From experience, I can say So some people think that, for example, this leading journal, Psychological Science, that you can't get published there if you don't have that stamp of approval for pre-registration. I just want to say that's just plainly not true. I have a paper with a PhD student in this journal from 2022, and the journal did ask very briefly when we submitted, like, did you pre-register, and if not, why didn't you? And we were just able to write an explanation there that said this was a PhD study. It was we didn't really know what to expect. Well, that's the reason why we didn't do that. But we did get like the later stamp of approval for like open data and materials and stuff like that. So it can be like be like that, as long as you're just honest about
100%.
the process, I think.
Yeah, I think like one of the main things I would say is that it's a waste to not do a pre-registration if you do know that stuff, because then you're not getting the credit for having those thoughts before you ran the study. So it's almost like I would just treat pre-registration as a way that people can know what you did know before you started. And if you feel like you knew so little that it's not worth pre-registering, then that's absolutely fine. It's also fine to have a very simple pre-registration that just has like vague research questions that you're interested in investigating. But yeah, it's also fine to not have anything and just to justify that. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. Lucas?
Happy with Dua going fast. If
Yeah, Dua also has their hand up.
Oh, sorry, Dua, you can go.
No worries.
Thank you, Lucas. I want to ask, as Susan mentioned, so there are some journals. I mean, is it true that there are some journals that won't accept you, won't let you publish with them if you don't have pre-registration? There are some who have this condition. It has to be pre-registered in order for them to accept you and let you publish with them.
Yeah, there are some journals. I think there's very few in psychology. I think maybe meta psychology is one of them. I'm not sure which other ones, if any. But I'm pretty sure that even the ones that do require it, they only require it for studies that, like, for hypothesis testing research. Like, I think that you can still publish other types of work there. I'd have to look into that. But I know that that's the case for open data. Like, even journals that have an open data requirement that you have to share your data, they don't mean you have to share it if you're not allowed to share it. Like, they just mean if you're allowed to, then you have to. So yeah, I think in most of these cases, you need to kind of like read a bit more in detail about what it means for it to even be required. But yes, there are some journals that do require pre-registration, and there is debate about whether that makes sense or not. But yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Last question from Lucas, because it's 11:45.
Hi. Thanks. I don't think these are very good questions. But so obviously, one of the things in the future would be nice to have is more people doing open science, right? Like that's kind of the main goal. But can you see other things that would be like positive future things to target rather than just breadth? Like, is there any other things that you personally maybe or you think open science in general could have as objective?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh my God. Too big a question to answer to do justice to. But I think, okay, so one thing is what I talked about at the beginning about making open science actually open to people everywhere from like all types of institutions in all types of countries. So that's one goal that I think that's been an interesting journey with SIPS, the Society for the Improvement of Psychological Science. Initially started mostly talking about like replicability and very like that kind of like research designy questions, and now has a massive focus on increasing diversity and generalizability within psychology. So I think that that's a massive goal that we need to also have. And then I also think that changing the entire structure of like scientific publishing is a massive passion of mine. And that people have different ideas about what the best route would be for that, and that would be a whole different talk. But some people think that we should abolish journals altogether. Others think that journals should exist but only serve kind of a curatorial capacity. Other people think that papers should be abolished, and we should have other ways of disseminating our scientific outputs and not focusing on this kind of like textual summary. So yeah, there's lots of directions that it can go in. But yeah, incremental progress as well as these kind of like big thinking about restructuring science need to both happen at the same time, I think. So yeah.
Yeah, very interesting.
Thank you so much. We're running a little bit over, so we can stop the session here, but thank you very much, Priya, for your beautiful presentation, and congratulations on all this very important work. I've posted a few more details about your website and email address in the chat.
Thanks a lot.
And the recording will be made available later. I can also send it to yourself if you're interested in having it.
Please. That'd be great.
Thanks to all for being here, and please fill in the feedback form for this session, which is also in the chat.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much. See you all later. Bye.
Bye.